tax rates, so there's no cost that isn't typically considered, and if they forget about it up front, they find a way to pass a new law to make you pay for it down the road. So I think it's education and doing the right thing and having a good structure of compliance in place to make sure when you do have a problem, it's addressed in a transparent way that the public can have confidence in.
Right. Heathcliff, in Malta this year that has been a change in regulation that also included earlier this year a change in taxation. When you take these decisions as a regulator to change taxation applicable to the sector, what are the top of the mind considerations? Do you put economic impact, sustainability of the business first, regulatory concerns? How to juggle them all?
Well, it's quite a discussion because, as you are aware, we've been working on the new law for months, years, I would say, and there's always the discussion with government because us as the regulator we propose and we advise government on gambling law. However, then it's the legislator who finally decides. And the discussions we had were very interesting in the sense that yes, governments obviously are interested in taxation, definitely, because they do see gambling as a cash cow to a certain extent. And the discussions we had when we discussed the new tax law were pretty much, so politicians were interested in the total amount of money. They wanted to make sure that that revenue stream kept coming. But at the same time, from us, from our end as the regulator, with the old regime we had, let's face it, there were particular, I'm not sure whether there are many who are perhaps familiar with our licensing, the old licensing regime. We had the traditional Class 104, we call it. And that was sort of a license, a particular license which we believed was, to a certain extent, somewhat abused in the sense that there were many operators using that license. Why? Because the taxation wasn't really adequate. That we fixed it. So we took this opportunity to, not to increase taxes, but to make sort of the tax regime fair, because we believe there was sort of an unfair advantage on that particular license. However, because you mentioned the discussion even with the politicians and what's of interest, yes, I would say the politicians are interested in the economic stream, definitely, and in the revenues. However, even when we discussed, for example, issues related to advertising, because you mentioned revenue streams, obviously gaming companies do advertise a lot. However, the proposals we went to government with were, to a certain extent, less strict than the ones we have. Why? Because the politicians wanted then to have stricter regulations when it comes to advertising. Why? Because yes, economic revenues, the revenue aspect from this industry is very, very important. However, politicians were even sort of are interested in the protection of the vulnerables, the social impact of this industry. And let's face it, whereas the vast majority of the players managed to gamble in a proper way and have fun with this, with the different types of games there are in this industry, there are still those who still end up in a bad situation, family issues, and it is the role of the regulator and the government to protect these vulnerables. So it's always there always needs to be somewhat of a balance to a certain extent.
So things are changing, regulations change, taxation change. Well, the Japanese attitude towards gambling business has definitely changed fundamentally. Because in July there was a decision taken to open up the market and up to 3 casino resorts will be opened. Hitoshi, can you please give us some background to this, reasoning behind it, and you know, what caused this change and what you expect from this change as a contribution of the industry to Japan?
Yes, so Olga just mentioned Japan passed the law to legalize casinos this past July, only about a month ago. And the reason for this passage was to boost tourism in Japan. That's one, and the other is to address the aging population and to gain revenues, as we've been discussing. And the law says that the tax rate, or it's called the levy, for the gaming revenue will be 30%. And on top of that, probably a corporate tax would be imposed, but that's kind of up to the government to decide. So this may be waived or decreased. It's up to the future regulations. And as Olga mentioned, we are expecting to have 3 we call it integrated resorts, which includes casino, open within the next several years. But the law also says that this number of locations will be reviewed in 7 years, so from the date of license of the first entity. So assuming that the license would come in the next 3 or 4 years, there will be a review conducted by the year probably around 2030 to maybe increase the number of locations or not. And for the impact or the contribution of the economic growth, this would probably depend on where the actual location is going to be. Japan, this casino implementation law has a structure where the local government will have to first say, we want to have a casino in our jurisdiction. And then the national government will choose among them saying, okay, we'll pick you guys. And as you can imagine, the economic impact will differ, taking United States, for example, for having a casino in New York as opposed to Alaska. So it is difficult for the time being to, determine what the contribution of to the economy would have, the casino would have, because, like I said, it's one thing to have an integrated resort casino close to Tokyo as opposed to like Hokkaido, which is like Alaska. And probably, it would depend on the actual location as to for the operators to determine the amount of money they would like to invest. So that's another factor that we would have to think of. So to sum it up, we're kind of at a beginning of the change, as Logo mentioned. So we're looking to see this change would have a good economic impact to the Japanese.
And more widely in Asia, how do you see the development of jurisdiction regulation? Generally it is illegal, especially online gaming illegal. How do you see it developing in the future? And how does it relate to the impact, current impact, which is largely unregulated gaming there, with potential impact when it becomes regulated?
It is kind of difficult for me to answer the entire Asia market because it's rather big. But talking for Japan specifically, online gaming is not necessarily prohibited, but it's not regulated. We only have like a century-year-old penal code saying that gambling is prohibited. That's it. And there's no recent court judgment, not either prosecuting online gaming operators or saying that that is illegal. So, like Ogo said, it's vastly unregulated. And so there are operators operating in Japan, and there are various online gaming operators trying to enter the Japanese market. But that comes at a risk of, understanding that this is a gray market. We have like a 100-year-old, like I said, penal code, and a 100-year-old Supreme Court judgment saying that gambling is illegal. And there is a debate going on whether clicking like bet button from Japan constitutes a gambling from Japan. Since online gambling would only be illegal if certain activity would be conducted in Japan, because Japanese penal code doesn't have any extraterritorial jurisdictions. So if the events are taking place overseas, Japanese police and prosecutors cannot go after them. So gambling under the penal code is structured. It just says gambling, so it doesn't define what is gambling or what is not, and there's no distinction between a game of chance and game of skills. So, like I said, it is vastly unregulated. So that's where Japan is as of the time being. And recent change for the casino may trigger the discussion to move forward with regulating online gambling, legalizing and prohibiting it. So we're at a stage of, we're kind of at a breaking point as to which way we would go.
Right. Moving from Japan to US. And the opening of the sports betting, online sports betting market. John mentioned that, if I understood you correctly, you see future developing as a symbiosis, so to speak, a partnership between the land-based operations and online sports betting providers for a win-win situation, right? So you see a bright future, if I understood you correctly. Do you want to add something to this?
No, I think that's right. We see a lot of potential to integrate the two businesses, Clearly, sports betting is coming in the U.S. It's with states' rights. It's a state-by-state approach, but that is where we see the future.
Michael, what is your view? Who will be the winners and the losers of this new regulation and the liberalization?
My clear answer is it depends.
Very
And-
clear answer indeed.
And no, it depends on the policies that different states adopt. And there's two distinct trends that are taking place. One is that in certain states, is lotteries and independent online operators, i.e. those that are not tied to a land-based operation, are seeking to enter the sports betting and or online markets. And there's another track where the land-based operators are seeking to have primacy in the online and sports betting space. And we've looked at this. We've done studies on this. It's not, I wouldn't characterize it as an opinion, and more of a finding, is that when you do tie sports betting and online, both of which will ultimately, in every jurisdiction, be handled through mobile devices, you're going to do much better and have greater economic impacts, which is the focus of this panel, if it is tied to land-based casinos, as John made clear. There's two fundamental laws of human nature that have been there since Prague was founded. One is that people like games of chance, and two is that people like to be in social settings. Those are immutable laws, and if sports betting and online take advantage of that and go in that direction, it's going to have a greater economic impact than if they choose the other approach.
Right. Heathcliff, what is your view on change of the economic impact of the remote gaming industry to Maltese economy, in view of the fact that more and more European countries in particular come up with their local legislations and require local licenses, and therefore some of the GGR on which the taxation is based would not be falling under the taxation in Malta?
Well, one we need to keep in mind, as I said before, that in Malta we have a very strong land-based sector as well. That's very strong. So with the local casinos, there are 4 local casinos, the gaming parlor, and that's very strong. Then in terms of the remote per se, yes, it's true that there are now other national regimes, national jurisdictions. But here we need to keep in mind that there are two types of operators. There are operators who are in Malta because they want the Malta license. However, as you are aware, in Malta, we allow even other EU operators to operate in or from Malta with a new license. Now, what we did on that aspect with the new law, we introduced the notification in the sense that previously any EU operator was allowed to operate in and from Malta just by using that license. However, the regulator wasn't aware who these operators were. Now, with the new law, we introduced the power to ask for notification so that as the regulator, we still want to know who these operators are. Who are operating from Malta, and we still and we will have the power we have now because the law got introduced on the 1st of August. We have the power to ask for even conduct criminal probity checks on them, want reporting, but we want to make sure that those operators who choose Malta for a place of establishment rather than to use the EMJ license, want to make sure that those operators are still reputable operators. However, from the way we are looking at it, because obviously we do have our reports, the outlook is still positive. Because you mentioned the GGR, but as you are aware, the taxes have the cappings, and with a number of large operators, even if they remove the GGR of that particular country, where now they would need to have their own license there, with the cappings still very positive for us.
Thank you. Let's look at totally different trend and see how it affects the economic contribution and impact of the industry. Technology, development of technology. Let's see, for example, if with the use of artificial intelligence, there will be great reduction of human resources need in the industry. We see that chatbots are already doing customer support. Predictive analytics, machine learning techniques are used in order to predict behaviors of players, to detect anomalies, to detect fraud, and so on and so forth. It is possibly not very far away that croupiers and casinos will be robots. And you will not need a supervisor on the floor because it will be all automated. How will that affect contribution of the industry to the economy from the point of view of employment? Everybody's view, please. how will reduction in employment, which potentially can be brought about by the new technologies like artificial intelligence, will affect the contribution of the industry to the economy?
To me.
To everyone.
Well, I mean, first of all, I can't even get my arms around natural intelligence, never mind artificial intelligence. But the whole concept, what I can tell you is this, is that the conventional wisdom in the gaming industry has been wrong far more often than it's been right. And the conventional wisdom, the best example is that emerging generations would migrate towards slot machines because they're comfortable with technology, and table games would be a thing of the past. And we see how valid that is. Table games are the future. So the slot floor, as we know it, as it exists in most markets, is going away. You don't see millennials playing slot machines. And you're not going to. And you're not going to see future generations playing slot machines. The whole business model is going to change. Is this going to impact employment? Of course it is. It's going to require a real partnership between government and the industry that it regulates to allow this industry to adapt to that, so that gaming becomes much more of an entertainment center rather than simply a gaming center. And that unless it does that, employment is not going to increase. It'll go down.
John?
I think it's a little different answer whether you're a land-based casino or online. Obviously, for online, investment in technology will continue. I don't know that it eliminates jobs there. I think it probably creates jobs for people writing new code and developing new technology. Land-based, in essence, we're a customer service business and an entertainment business, and I think the personal touch will always be there. It may shift around, but I don't think you're going to see anytime soon casinos where you have robot dealers and robot bellmen and things of that sort. I think there'll be technology innovations that enhance customer service, but you're not going to do away with the personal touch.
Right. Heathcliff, what about blockchain and embracement of blockchain by gaming? The technology allows full traceability, transparency. Maybe some regulatory function will become redundant.
Well, for blockchain, blockchain is a very interesting proposition. We are actively looking at blockchain as a country and thus even as the regulator. What we've seen in terms of blockchain, well, in terms of employment, I would say sometimes new technologies, rather than reduce jobs, I would say they replace jobs. Because yes, there are some jobs which would get redundant, but then you need the technology people behind the creation of the new software, the new technology. In terms of blockchain, as you are aware, in Malta we are looking, as the gaming regulator, we are looking at adopting a sandbox approach. And through the sandbox approach, whereby we will create a test and learn environment, we also had the opportunity to discuss a lot with a number of operators who are not necessarily in the gaming business yet, but they are in the DLT business. And the number of propositions we saw were very interesting. For example, the advantages blockchain gives to companies conducting KYC. It's very, very interesting. So there are some interesting propositions. And I would look at it as something positive in the sense that, yes, potentially there would be some companies who, rather than doing KYC and having a group of individuals literally doing KYC manually, they would be using different technologies. But on that aspect, you would anyhow be able to use those resources where there is more need. But anyhow, behind the company creating the solution for the KYC, anyhow, there needs to be employees who would be creating this software. So I would say that technology and new development should always be looked at from a positive angle, because ultimately a lot of industries need to, even governments, need to embrace technology.
So we do not, it seems to be that we are not projecting a doom and gloom with the negative impact on employment. We just see that the skill set requirement will change. I'm very conscious of the time we have taken so far. I would like to open the floor for questions to our panel, please. Right. 30 seconds, every speaker, please. What is your outlook on the positive or negativity of the contribution of the industry in the next 5 years to your economies?
I think gaming will continue to be an economic driver in the communities that embrace it. I think it's a bright outlook. I think in the United States anyway, it's maturing as an accepted industry and a major contributor to the economy, and I think that'll continue.
I'm going to make a point that I made in a conversation with Hitoshi last evening. There's a rush in some markets to expand and to adopt gaming, and my advice is to go slowly and go carefully, because there are no do-overs. Once you establish the rules and you issue the licenses, you cannot go back and undo it. And you have to look at it extremely carefully in every aspect, from who has the privilege of offering gaming to what the tax rates are and what's going to be required of them. You can only do it once, and you have to do it right. That I think is the key lesson.
Well, I think, Olga, that I believe that for the foreseeable future, gaming will continue to grow. But I believe it's very, very important that we make sure that it grows in a sustainable way. And growing in a sustainable way also involves the operators per se, in the sense that many times there are situations where operators wait for regulatory action to change something. And that has to change. I believe there needs to be a shift in mentality whereby operators are the ones who anticipate regulators, in the sense that why should an operator wait for regulatory action and then fix something which most probably they know already that it should be fixed? Why should you wait for regulatory action? So that is very important. Compliance and obviously even making sure that operators are aligned with the various regulations in terms of the Fourth Anti-Money Laundering Directive. It's very, very important that the industry is maturing, especially in the online space. It's been there for a number of years. And when an industry is maturing, we need to make sure that it matures in the right way. And the right way is being compliant with the regulations, but even anticipating regulatory action.
Yeah, so like I said, we recently passed this casino law just a month ago. So obviously, you want to have this, to be a positive result. But as like Michael mentioned, we need to have this successful casino for the first go. As I mentioned earlier, we're doing a review in the 7th year after the first license. So if the first one fails, this wouldn't follow. I mean, the number of casinos wouldn't increase. So, like I said, I'm looking for the positive result, and this, we should get it right for this first time around.
Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking our panel for an insightful discussion this morning. Thank you.
Thank you, Olga, for chairing the panel, and panelists for that very interesting insight into essentially the contribution of gambling. So thank you again. I'd now like to ask Simon Planzer and his panel to come up in respect to keeping crime out of gambling. Okay, so Simon Planzer is the principal of Planzer Law in Zurich, leading Swiss lawyer in respect of the gambling sector, fully conversant with developments in Switzerland. You may hear a bit more about that. And I'll let Simon introduce his panelists. Simon is also going to be taking the lead in respect of one of the IMGL publications, which is European Gaming Lawyer. So if I could pass the microphone on to Simon, and he'll introduce the panel.
Thank you indeed, Jamie. Good morning, everybody. Very pleased to chair this panel. We've got highly interesting and topical theme to discuss today. We will cover, among other issues, AML regulation and supervision, and the recent trend that we can observe, both particularly in the UK and Europe and in the US, of heightened enforcement measures in recent time, be it by the FinCEN or the UK Gambling Commission. We will also approach KYC, what it really means in practice, and the importance of understanding source of funds. And I think before I continue, I want to give credit to Nick Nocton, who unfortunately couldn't join us today, but I would like to point out that he was instrumental in preparing this panel as well. So thank you to Nick, who unfortunately couldn't join us. Having said that, I would like to very briefly introduce our panelists. We've got Donna Moore from Fox and Rothschild. Donna brings a very interesting and relevant background in the theme that we are discussing today. As a former federal prosecutor, she has been on the other side, so to say, investigating these crimes. She has also been a former regulator. She will certainly tell us also a bit more about that perspective. And now she's a practicing attorney and partner with Fox Rothschild. We then have Dr. Matthias Spitz from Germany. He's with Melchers, partner with Melchers. He advises leading sports betting brands on AML compliance in Germany. He's also a member of the AML work group of the German Sports Betting Association and the deputy AML officer at his law firm. We then have Chris Elliott, to my right, from the UK. He's an associate in Wiggins' betting and gaming team. For many years now, about 5 years, he's been fully dedicated, 100% of his time working on British online gambling industry matters. And for about the last 2 years, he especially has focused on advising operators through regulatory enforcement and compliance processes in the UK. Finally, last but not least, we do have Jeff Ifrah with us. Very pleased, thank you. He is the founder of Ifrah Law, and prior to beginning his defense work in the gaming industry, Jeff worked as a federal prosecutor in the state of New Jersey, dealing with many fraud and AML matters as well. And as a defense lawyer now, Jeff has defended large gaming prosecutions and AML prosecutions, including most recently the US enforcement actions led by the US Department of Treasury against global payment processor PACnet. And I should also emphasize that Jeff, according to his website, does hands-on counsel approach with gloves off litigation. And I would say, let's do this gloves off directly on AML matters. So Jeff, I'd like to start with you. Could you give us a brief overview of recent enforcement actions in the US? What have you noticed in terms of high fines and enforcement?
Sure. CG Technology has been in the news a lot lately, both recently regarding a Nevada penalty, but also prior to that, they had an AML problem. Prior to that, we had our current president, the Trump Taj Mahal, had some AML issues. And prior to that, Las Vegas Sands, who's owned by the major donor behind our current president. You know, I guess it can happen to everyone. These are huge fines over the past couple years. So I think in the past 4 years, you had Las Vegas Sands paid $47 million that originated from an AML investigation. And then you had Trump Taj Mahal, I don't know, it was about 10 million, but they were in bankruptcy, and it's not really clear that there was a lot of meaning behind that particular penalty. And then more recently, CG Technology and Cantor Gaming in New York. The one thing that all of these cases have in common is that in the United States, we have a form of reporting that most countries have that's related in some way to anti-money laundering, and they're called suspicious activity reports. And so there's two ways that these investigations happen in the United States. It's either that the casino operator or whoever is covered, it could be any type of financial service provider. So these reports apply to everyone, not just simply casino operators. But basically, if you have someone that you're suspicious of for whatever reason, a lot of times you actually facilitate the transaction, but then you report the underlying suspicion, whatever it is. So the Department of Treasury, sometimes the Secret Service, will investigate those reports. There's literally millions of these reports filed a year, so it's not like all of them get followed up. Typically what happens is these investigations are started, they're really backed into. So there will be an investigation of some group. For example, in the Cantor Gaming case, the Eastern District of New York, which basically covers federal criminal prosecution over Queens and Brooklyn and parts of Staten Island. So they were investigating basically a criminal organization that was running bets throughout the United States, and they were actually they had these runners that were going back and forth to Nevada, placing these bets on behalf of other people, which is illegal in the United States. And as these people were being investigated, the question in the agent's mind came up, well, hey, why wasn't this suspicious? And then they look at whether or not the casino filed the reports. And in this particular case, they hadn't. And so, so that's kind of somehow they can get ensnared that way. It's really kind of a frustrating business to provide compliance advice on, because even in the other two cases, the suspicious activity reports had been filed and the transaction had been completed, which is proper, but nevertheless, permitting those type of transactions to go through and filing those reports can also sometimes lead to trouble. And in the casino world, there's so much money going on that the fines have nothing, they don't bear necessarily a correlation to the actual amount of the transaction. Sometimes literally the sky is the limit. And so that's in the land-based setting. I haven't really talked about the online setting, but obviously this is a big area of enforcement concern.
Thank you very much, Jeff. So we can note that SARs are often at the source of issues in casino compliance work. I would like to pass the next question to Donna. So Jeff has outlined all these cases that we've observed in the US and the FinCEN activity. Do you see a particular driver in the escalation of all these enforcement activities in the US?
So here's I think the driver, if you will, is there's a natural friction between the government investigations and the casinos. And the friction is that the government, and to some extent rightly so, wants the casino companies and online companies and route gaming operators and whatever to take an active role in making sure that their employees understand and do things like suspicious activity and know your customer. And the reason why the feds think that is because when you have, for instance, a big high roller, a known high roller come into the casino knows what they like to drink, what they like to eat, which room they like. They know all these things about their customer base. And yet sometimes the compliance part fails in some instances when they turn a blind eye. And so some of these enforcement actions that we've seen are really failures of the system. So, you know, when somebody walks into your casino with a duffel bag full of cash and you don't get a SARS report, you have to wonder what your employees were doing. And part of the problem is that it really is, from an outside lawyer's perspective, it's a compliance issue that starts at the top. And if the management of the company doesn't buy into the compliance, which is expensive, as many of the in-house lawyers know, it's an expensive proposition, but it's far less expensive on the front end than on the back end. It's not going to be $47 million and a black eye for your company. And so there's this friction between government and regulatory oversight, and really state regulators, I don't believe are equipped. It's mainly the federal government, if we're not too busy investigating Russia, who have to do this. And for the most part, most of the casino companies are good, have good regulations in place, but they need to test them, and they need to really, from the top down, make it an important thing to really know the customer and not slip up. I mean, some of these reports that you read they didn't get the social security number and name matched up. I mean, these are easy things to fix.
So, Donna, allow me to deepen this point. I think this is very relevant, this tension between compliance and commercial interests. If I understand correctly, you're arguing that casinos know their customers very well from the commercial perspective in all kind of details, and will treat them greatly as high rollers and VIPs, especially in that area. But when it comes to the compliance side, something goes wrong. Can we deepen that a little bit? Maybe Jeff and Donna together.
Well, listen. The good news is that for the most part, this industry is the most transparent industry going in terms of compliance, money flow, whatever. But I do think that there are moments where you have to say, okay, what Trump? I don't know if I want to say that. What trumps here? Is it that we want this guy coming into the casino and spending a lot of money, and we are going to kind of sort of look the other way when it comes to getting his information or asking too many questions about where his money's coming from, versus our bottom line profit? And that's always going to be a business risk that casinos are going to say, what outweighs the other? I mean, for the most part, the training is good, and sometimes you just have a rogue employee. So those are things I think that management just has to be aware of and try to counteract, without hopefully getting in trouble with FinCEN.
Yeah, and I would also just add that sometimes in these federal investigations, what ends up happening is that the suspicious activity report may be it may have been filed, it may not have been filed, but it's just the start. Even if it has been filed, the feds will come in and then they'll look at, okay, well, let's look at this compliance program. Let's look at whether it's audited. Let's look at the compliance officer. The other thing that you can do as an organization is if you anticipate what kind of questions enforcement is going to ask, in a land-based casino or even online, they're going to ask who is incentivized to essentially break these rules and look the other way. Like Donna was saying, who deals with the high rollers? Your VIP program and your VIP hosts. So in the land-based setting, these VIP hosts become very important. Online, it's the same type of thing. Every site has these sharks, these assassins in the sports betting world, and these are the type of people who, like Donna said, are going to spend a lot of money, and therefore you have to know who is incentivized to kind of look the other way in order to bring these people in. And that's where an audit needs to focus. That's where compliance needs to focus. And if I'm a federal agent coming into a facility or sending out a subpoena, that's what I'm going to want to know. I'm going to want to talk to that particular person. I'm going to want to look at his customer list. That's the highly proprietary stuff that every casino has, and that's the first thing I'm going to look at.
Very good. Thank you very much. I want to move over the pond to Europe and take the example of Germany. Matthias, I understand the AML situation in Germany is a peculiar one. Could you please give us just a brief overview of the difference in approaches in Germany regarding AML compliance?
Yeah, thank you. I think you can say, I think it's fair to say that the situation is completely the other way around. Of course, Germany, like many other EU member states, had to implement the fourth AML directive, and eager as we Germans are, our federal government took really hasty steps to implement the fourth AML directive in time, meaning by the 26th June of last year. The problem was only that they forgot to do the risk analysis before. As you may know, the the idea of the fourth AML directive is that you have risk analysis on various levels, meaning you have a supranational risk analysis on the level of the European Commission. Member states conduct a risk analysis, and based on these risk analysis, you implement measures to mitigate the risks you find in the various business sectors, which I think is a reasonable approach. Now, since that risk analysis had not been done, it was like kind of making up stuff as you go. So the approach of the Federal Ministry of Finance that was leading the legislative approach was really to to hasten the effort, and unfortunately that resulted in a very impractical and strict approach, so a very prescriptive approach when it comes to KYC. You don't have any threshold in the online gambling sector like in other European countries. You have to KYC your customers upon any registration, so which is a real cost factor compliance-wise, because you have to use databases, and that means you have costs for customers even if they don't gamble at all later on after registration. And then you also have some institutional aspects that are costly in terms of internal revision and specific requirements to AML officers, just to name outline of a few aspects. Now, all of this sounds like you would have a very strong AML compliance regime in our country. Just the situation is no one complies with it in the online space because obviously it's not very popular to comply with these strict requirements. And what's happening is that we can see there's a kind of forum shopping in Europe, at least from, I can say for the online gambling operators. In the land-based sector it's different. But most of the online gambling companies take the view that they are subject to the AML legislation of their country of residence or the licensing jurisdiction, which in many cases is Malta, or in some cases still used to be Gibraltar, where obviously there's a very reasonable approach to AML, but it's different to the legal requirements in our country. So and that is kind of, I think, the connecting element to our discussion we can see when you have an over-regulation in the AML sector that kind of pressures companies that want to be compliant into a very difficult commercial situation. And as I said, in our country has resulted into effectively most of the online market not being compliant with the local standards.
Very good. So maybe one aspect I would like to deepen, Matthias, is this tension between national law and EU law, right? Especially maybe for the non-EU lawyers in here. If you could briefly explain, I mean, on the one hand, you have some German regulators that say, well, this is all illegal, and you might be automatically in AML issues, whereas the operators argue, no, it's not. It's actually compliant with EU law. Could you just briefly outline the argumentation on each side?
Yeah, I think that's a very, very good point, and kind of the tension that has, or the underlying problem that has, from a legal point of view, dominated the situation in Germany, and is also the reason why most of the online market is grayish. The gambling legislation in our country is based on a federal state's law, so not the legislation of the federal government, but legislation agreed upon between the German states by way of an interstate treaty on gambling. And again, the approach taken here is an approach where I can say it's over-regulation that is not geared to the specifics of online gambling and to the commercial needs of the industry, which is why operators, or most of the industry, takes the view that restrictions contravene EU law, specifically the freedom of services. There has been a whole plethora of jurisprudence from the Court of Justice of the EU. So there's I won't go into the details, but one of the landmark judgments has been in 2016 in the INSE case, where essentially all of the sports betting licensing process has been deemed to be non-transparent and non-compliant with EU law. So that's why we are still in a kind of in a situation where regulation is not applied, and when you don't have a reasonable regulation and when you don't have licensing, that also means you don't have enforcement of compliance. And that also includes AML compliance, which in other countries often is part of the licensing conditions and part of the licensing regime. So this is another part of the problem. Obviously, many regulators in our country would take a different view and would say, we have these restrictions in the law, it's a formal law. Whether the arguments under EU law are correct or not is something that is yet to be decided by the courts, or subject to court litigation. And there are some regulators who take the view that all of the online operations are illegal. So whether you are legal or not in our country is pretty much a matter of perspective. And if you take the view that online gambling is illegal, then that automatically means you are a money launderer. Specifically in the online casino sector, that is a difficult situation because online casino legally is not allowed in our country. Still, we have over 320 websites where you can gamble all day. And yeah, this is the tension that is there. Yeah.
Thank you. You outlined that very well. So what makes it even more complex, you have differing views from European courts and German courts on the matter. So that makes it even more complicated, bring us to the conclusion where you have two lawyers, you have three opinions, right? So that's unfortunately a complex situation in Germany. Let's move to the UK. The UK has often been in the media in our sector in recent years for enforcement measures. Elliot, what do you think? What have been the drivers there, similar to the US? Maybe in the US we heard it was SARS activities. What have been the drivers in the UK for the UK Gambling Commission to take such a strong stance?
Yeah, as you said, I mean, the UK Gambling Commission it's been well publicised. Any observer of the UK online market and retail market has known that the Commission's changed its approach to enforcement. So in the last 18 months to 24 months, we've seen it taking swifter and more severe action against a number of operators for both AML failings and social responsibility failings. Principally driven by a concern with the frequency with which cases come before its desk, where invariably someone has been stealing money to fund a gambling problem and they've not been challenged sufficiently early in their cycle with an operator as to where they might be getting their money from or whether they might have a gambling issue. And you know, us as advisors have been involved working with operators through the process of those enforcement cases, looking back as to how policies which were in place at the time worked to try and manage the AML risks that were presented to the particular business. And the concerns that they have had and continue to have really stem on AML policies not being effective. So really what we've seen in public statements around basically all major operators have had one public statement or another around AML or some social responsibility failing. The concern that they've had is that their policies for managing risk, they incur too much risk, basically. So they set their threshold for when they're going to start asking questions too high. Generally speaking, operators are quite good at carrying out basic customer due diligence, at least the major operators are. But really the concern they've got is where you get your higher spending customers, so your VIP kind of customers, who too often they're kind of slipping through the net because, for the similar reasons you've explained, Donna, they so it's for the same reasons as actually the concern is that there's this tension between the commercial imperative of making sure you look after your VIP customers versus managing the AML risks that may be presented by those customers. As well as a sort of policy limitations, they've also seen that, particularly in the online space, AML teams have just not been resourced properly to be able to deal with risk that has actually been presented to a business. So a VIP customer might be flagged and come on the radar of a compliance team, but there's literally not enough people in the team to be able to interact with that customer to ask where they may be getting their money from. So they're the two kind of main themes, at least on the AML side.
Okay, excellent. Thank you very much. I'd also like to point in this context to two reports that the Gambling Commission drafted in recent time. One is a risk assessment conducted by the Gambling Commission, and the other is an enforcement report that provides a pretty good summary of the issues, some of which you already mentioned. If we go to the first report, the risk assessment. So contrary to Germany, apparently this was done in the UK by the Gambling Commission. What are the kind of high-risk situations that the UK Gambling Commission has identified?
Yeah, so just in the same way that operators are mandated under the regulations to carry out their own risk assessments to identify what AML risks are presented to their business, the Gambling Commission too is mandated to carry out its own risk assessment to identify where in the sector that it's the supervisory body for presents the highest money laundering risks. We're in this slightly anomalous position in the UK that actually the Commission's view of risk is different from the government. So under the EU money laundering directives, you can't exempt casinos, so that is definitely a higher risk from an AML perspective. But actually within the fourth anti-money laundering directive, it gave member states an ability to exempt certain sectors which were considered to be low risk. Now, contrary to the Commission's advice, the government actually, in the wider context of wider AML risk, considered betting to be a lower risk activity, and so it actually technically is exempt from the money laundering regulations, but nevertheless the Commission has sought to implement license conditions which basically mandates that betting operators also have to carry out AML risk assessments to identify what elements of their business are vulnerable to AML risk as well.
Would you agree that it's probably a good idea that they also have to comply with these regulations when it comes in particular to bookies and cash payments?
Exactly. I mean, I have to agree. I mean, I think, too often, it's not nice sometimes as an advisor to the industry working with operators who are being hit over the head with a stick through enforcement processes. Often the context of that is, someone is stealing money, a lot of money, to feed a gambling problem. So you're kind of faced with the darker side of, or the reality of the effects that gambling can have on some people. And so you see some people spend sometimes extraordinary amounts of money in betting shops, in cash, and they're just not being picked up on the radar. I mean, we're talking, a few years ago, the industry has done a lot of growing up, but, the risks presented to betting are, at least a high risk, maybe not quite as high as casino, but I consider, betting, from what we've seen, certainly deserves attention from an AML perspective.
Indeed, I couldn't agree more. And what is fairly ironic is often in discussions, political discussions, online is singled out as particularly dangerous with regarding AML, whereas in online you usually have a track record. You can follow the different steps more easily than in a land-based sector, especially when we're talking cash, of course. So please, I wanted to, please, if you want to add to that, Donna.
I just wanted to follow up. We're talking about risk. We're talking about who, the employees that are on the front lines for determining when there might be an issue, when they should fill out a SARS report. And, one of the concerns in the U.S. is that we are now holding individuals responsible, not just companies responsible, but, compliance officers are in a tricky position because, it falls on them. So even if the compliance officer has brought a problem to management, he or she may not be in the position of actually getting their way on the issue, and yet they might be the ones that are held out to be responsible. And so I think, the good news, bad news for a casino, just like everything else, you never hear about the problems that get fixed before they're public, right? Every so often you hear, oh, we caught somebody before they committed the act. So there's no glory in having your staff well-trained to prevent an AML problem. Nobody pats you on the back and says, guess what? You didn't get fined $47 million, right? So nobody knows about all your good work. But the flip side is that's a good thing. So when you talk about incentives, it seems to me that one of the ways to help prevent the problem is the folks at the street level, if you will. Those are the folks that are coming in contact with these people, that they need to be incentivized to say, hey, I want to report this. I want to be more active because it helps my company and it helps me, and that's a way potentially that I think you can generate better compliance.
Thank you. So we are at the point where we discuss how to install a culture of compliance, right? And I think it can be fairly complex, actually, the issue. So one level you have described at the street level. But what about the situation the compliance officer hears about it, wants to implement it, but then gets heat from the commercial department, and the commercial department arguing, well, this player is far too important for us. So there can be an obvious tension and different interests involved. Everybody, maybe Jeff, you want to give it a start? How can this be remedied?
Well, in terms of a culture of compliance, I'll tell you something that's really fascinating, and Donna's point was exactly right. So you've all heard of Enron some years ago, but there were a few women there who were the so-called whistleblowers. And everyone always looks at whistleblowers as these bad folks, because they work inside a company and they're just money hungry and they just really want to make money, because in the United States, a whistleblower can actually get a percentage of the ultimate judgment against that company. So the SEC, which governs securities, and the FTC or the CFTC, and the IRS now are actually paying people up to 25% to bring them information that is not public based on an insider's knowledge. So you've actually had people who have been convicted of crimes while they're in jail, making more money than any of us in the room will ever make. It's unbelievable. Hundreds of millions of dollars in recoveries. And there's really a misconception about a lot of whistleblowers. We were actually hired by Lockheed Martin, a very big defense contractor in the United States, to look into this concept and train their compliance people. And one of the things that we did was we analyzed a whole bunch of whistleblower cases across the country for the past 10 years to try and come up with the profile of a true whistleblower. What are they? Are they a particular color, age, sex, gender? Like where do they fit in? Do they come into a certain position? Are they compliance officers? Who are they? And the one thing that we concluded, which is very consistent with what the Enron women were saying, is that when you have a culture of compliance and people know that this is a team effort and that everyone is behind them and that they're actually going to be rewarded for reporting and they know where to go to report, I mean, these are basic concepts, obviously, then those people are going to report internally. The Enron women didn't know where to go, and when they went somewhere, they got rebuffed. They didn't feel that it was important to upper management to report on something like this, and when they reported, they got treated like it wasn't important. So when someone in a casino environment is coming up against friction because the response to a concern is discussions about profitability and about revenue and about reputation and about competing, that is communicating to that concerned internal corporate citizen that compliance is not important. And if that happens, trust me, they are going to turn to the government and they're going to become incentivized to do all they can, and that's when they sort of turn to the dark side. So if you have an internal culture of compliance, people know where to go, you have constant training where you don't just talk about compliance, you talk about how important it is, how you're a team, and people know where to report, and there are posters, and there are hotlines, and all of those types of things, the amount of outside whistleblowing is really brought down. And not just that, but if there ever is, God forbid, a government investigation, all of these people are going to become the first line people who will be interviewed. The first people that the feds go to inside an organization is compliance. The reason why is because they expect that the compliance people are going to tell the government how frustrated they are, how no one listens to them, and the government's going to play that. And they're going to say to them, oh, it must be so hard for you every single time you're trying to bring these concerns and no one wants to listen. And these people become the #1 witnesses against the company. And that's why you have to be proactive within, create a culture, make sure that these people are well treated, that they know where to go, that they're listened to, and that these types of situations are brought to a minimum. And even if you can't, even if at the end of the day you decide commercial considerations may be relevant, you better make sure that your compliance officer